big history comparison between the Afro-Eurasian and American world zones reveals a striking parallel in their historical evolution. Everywhere, the transition to agriculture led to the appearance of larger and more complex structures like chiefdoms and states, and in many places where the Goldilocks conditions were just right, to huge agrarian civilizations. This parallel is so remarkable that we might reasonably expect to find something very similar occurring wherever human societies formed. And yet we know that even within many regions of Afro-Eurasia and the Americas, this did not happen. Furthermore, in two of our planet's four world zones, Australasia and the Pacific, not one single agrarian civilization formed, despite the fact that parts of these regions were occupied for something like 50,000 years. Does this mean that these world zones were subject to different developmental rules and therefore followed utterly different historical trajectories from those in Afro-Eurasia and the Americas? Or, if we were to look more closely, might we in fact see many of these same tendencies towards intensification and complexity were also in place in Australasia and the Pacific, but they had just not progressed as far as they did in the Americas and Afro-Eurasia? In this lecture, then, we dig beneath the surface in Australasia and the Pacific, looking for telltale signs of the increasing control of resources, of larger and denser populations, and of evolving social complexity. This will allow us to determine whether Australia and the Pacific were in essentially the same situation as the Americas. That is, the right ingredients were present and the right processes had begun, but important differences in the timing of the processes there, as compared with Afro-Eurasia, meant that these nascent civilizations were never able to reach their full potential because they were cut off at a critical moment by the arrival of Europeans. To Australia first, which by the time of British invasion in the early 19th century was home to about 1 million Aboriginal people. They were divided into hundreds of clan-based communities and spoke perhaps 250 different languages. The foundations of these communities and the cultures they constructed were laid down a very long time ago indeed, during the last ice age, when the Australian mainland was joined to the large islands of Tasmania in the south and New Guinea in the north, in a mega island continent known as Sahul. Sahul was colonized by maritime peoples from Southeast Asia at least 50,000 years ago. They used watercraft across wide bodies of open water when Ice Age sea levels were at least 150 feet lower than present. Within 5,000 to 10,000 years of their arrival, all of the sustainable environments within Sahul were supporting humans. They had proven themselves remarkably adaptable to these new ecological niches and also adept at making numerous innovations in response to ongoing climate change. Evidence of these adaptations can be found in rock art dating to between 30,000 and 20,000 years ago. It reveals lifeways that were later forced to change profoundly in response to climatic changes. In the far northern region of Arnhem Land, for example, the artists depicted the food they ate in their time, including yams and marsupials. Later, as rising sea levels transformed the once dry land into a region of swamps and lagoons, fish and turtles are featured instead. The earliest solidly datable evidence we have of humans in Sahul comes from the Ivan Valley in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, not far from the modern coastal city of Port Moresby, where radiocarbon dates of up to 49,000 years ago have been obtained on charcoal found with hunting and gathering stone tools. These Ice Age foragers lived in small clan-based communities and migrated with the seasons, connecting various resource-rich environments. By 10,000 years ago, agriculture had emerged independently in some highland communities of Papua New Guinea, where farmers had learned to domesticate yams and taro using swidden or slash and burn techniques. By 7,000 years ago, cultivation had intensified. Farming communities were constructing artificial mounds and drainage channels in conjunction with ongoing swidden and the cultivation of grasslands. These constructions imply the appearance of hierarchies and new forms of leadership to facilitate larger-scale farming of taro, bananas, yams, sugarcane, and sweet potato. They also suggest increased human populations. these early agrarian villages never achieved the critical levels of population density necessary to evolve into towns and larger political structures. But Papua New Guinea highland farming societies were considerably more complex than those of the island's coastal regions, where foraging remained the norm. Highlanders created more sophisticated art, rituals, and even forms of warfare. In Tasmania, at the far southern end of Sahul, rising sea levels after the last ice age eventually severed connections with the mainland, leaving Tasmania's population of perhaps 4,000 inhabitants isolated from other humans. As was the case with a number of Polynesian communities that we will explore in a moment, archaeologists can trace a return to smaller and simpler lifeways in Tasmania. Knowledge of sophisticated technologies like fine bone tools and organised fishing, and of complex social structures had been lost long before the arrival of Europeans. This suggests that technological innovation, or even the preservation of pre-existing technologies, simply cannot be sustained in small, isolated populations because the potential for collective learning is too limited and the struggle for mere survival is too pressing. Can we imagine something similar in the far distant future should human colonists in space find themselves cut off and isolated from other humans, leading to reduced collective learning and perhaps a reduction in the capacity for innovation? But rather than see these changes as signs of decline, we should view them as clever adaptations to climate change and to the realities of isolation. So abandoning fishing and focusing on the foraging of foodstuffs richer in fats, like seals and seabirds, might actually have been a very sensible ecological choice for the ancient Tasmanians. Despite the incredibly ancient foundations of Aboriginal communities, evidence suggests that within the past 3,000 to 4,000 years, more complex social structures in Australian Indigenous societies evolved quite rapidly. Distinctive types of stone tools were developed and spread across the continent. There was greater regional specialisation of rock art styles, the appearance of large-scale ceremonial gatherings involving hundreds of people, and the expansion of exchange systems. Curiously, despite the fact that some northern Australian Aboriginal groups probably had contact with farming populations in Papua New Guinea, they never made the transition to agriculture. Why not? Was it because Australian soils were generally very poor for farming, which meant that foraging was a much better survival strategy because it kept population densities sustainably low? Or was it a problem that early Australians shared with the inhabitants of many regions of the Americas, the lack of easily domesticable plant and animal species? Significantly, were the right Goldilocks conditions like reliable rainfall prevailed, particularly in communities along Australia's east, southeast and southwest coasts, larger population densities did appear. There we find evidence of economic and social intensification very similar to that which preceded the emergence of agriculture in other parts of the world. A good example of this is the affluent foraging community formed by the Gunditj Mara people, who constructed elaborate eel ponds in southeast Australia's Murray-Darling River system, built permanent villages, and developed social hierarchies. Archaeologists have found a significant increase in the number of inhabited sites during the 2 millennia prior to European conquest, a further indicator of substantial population increase. It may have been facilitated by the invention of new food acquisition technologies like fishhooks made from shells. Archaeologists have also discovered evidence in this period of numerous long-distance trade and exchange networks spanning hundreds and even thousands of miles across Australia. Two examples of this: narcotic drugs from southern Queensland in the northeast corner of the continent are found at sites in South Australia, and the huge quantities of ochre mined at Wilgimia in Western Australia must have been driven by substantial interregional demand and transported to far distant locations. Another example of the scale of these networks is the export of Baler and pearl shells from the tropical coast of northern Queensland. Over the past 2,000 years, these were exchanged clear across the continent, travelling all the way to the southern coasts along pathways 1,200 miles long. Evidence of social intensification is found in signs of large-scale gatherings that many groups participated in, which brought together hundreds of people for social, political and religious reasons, and included the performance of ceremonies like initiation, gift exchange, and marriage. These gatherings, called corroborees, could only take place where there were sufficient resources to feed this many people, so they were organized when food was available. For example, bunya festivals in South Queensland were scheduled to coincide with bumper crops of bunya pine seeds. Similarly, during summer months in the Southeast Australian Alps, after the snow had melted, hundreds of Aboriginal peoples from Victoria and New South Wales walked long distances to ascend the mountains for gatherings that coincided with the migrations of bogong moths. Each summer, millions of these moths migrate into the Alps to hibernate in cool, dry, and dark crevices between granite boulders to try and avoid the searing summer heat. They are highly nutritious, and their availability was what made these alpine summer gatherings possible. It wasn't just natural resources that sustained large communities. At Lake Condah in Southeast Australia, Aboriginal people dammed off the lake's outlet to maintain water levels and eel stocks around 4,600 years ago, probably to help avert the negative impacts of a warming and drying climate. Hydrological engineering on this scale demanded new levels of social organisation and complexity, including perhaps the appearance of hereditary leaders similar to chiefs. In Australia then, just as in North America, evidence of these technological, cultural and political developments can only leave us wondering how history might have played out differently had Australian Aboriginals been left to pursue their historical trajectories without European interference. As far as we know, the Pacific was the last world zone to be occupied by humans, an occupation that occurred in a series of colonising processes that can be divided into two distinct phases. The first occurred late in the Paleolithic era, when the islands of the Philippines and parts of Western Melanesia, including the Solomons, were settled 40,000 years ago. This occupation occurred not long after humans had also migrated into Australia, presumably using similar seagoing technologies. Then the colonisation of the Pacific stalled for many millennia, probably because crossing the vast distances of remote Oceania that separated the islands of the Pacific required navigational and seafaring skills that simply had not yet been developed. It wasn't until the middle of the second millennium BCE, so more than 38,000 years later, that a new wave of migration took humans deeper into the vast Pacific zone. This migration was led by new seafaring peoples who appeared in Southeast Asia and who spoke languages belonging to the Austronesian language group that probably originated on the island of Taiwan. These migrations that began 3,500 years ago have left striking archaeological evidence: obsidian tools and sophisticated fishing technologies, evidence of domesticated dogs, chickens, and pigs, and rounded ceramic pots with distinctive decorative patterns that archaeologists call lapita pottery. The name given to the pottery is also the name used to describe the people who made it. Over the course of a millennium, the lapita moved from Taiwan into the Philippines and onto the islands of the Bismarck Archipelago. In the centuries that followed, new migrations took the lapita deeper out into the Pacific, to the eastern Solomon Islands by 3,200 years ago, to Vanuatu, New Caledonia, and Fiji by 3,000 years ago, to Western Polynesia and the Central Pacific islands of Tonga by 2,900 years ago, and by 2,700 years ago to Samoa. Lapita peoples deliberately avoided settling in islands that were already densely populated, like Papua New Guinea, presumably because they were looking for new lands that would be much easier to colonize. Although this meant sailing for thousands of miles across the open ocean, eventually they occupied a large number of islands spanning an area of more than 3,000 miles. Apart from its distinctive pottery, archaeologists use other characteristic lapita features to trace these migrations, such as the use of obsidian for flake tools and the manufacture of clamshell cutting tools, shell fishhooks, and cone shell arm rings. Once settled in their new island homes, the lapita constructed stilt villages over platform reefs and thrived on a combination of farming and the foraging of marine resources like fish, sharks, turtles, and shellfish. The lapita had carried their agricultural domesticates with them in their canoes, introducing to Oceania animals such as the pig, the dog, chicken, and the Pacific rat, and at least 15 plant species, including taro, yams, and bananas. Migrations over these enormous distances provide clear evidence of the sort of advanced navigation and sailing skills these seafaring colonists had attained. And it wasn't as if the Lapita only made the journey once. There is plenty of evidence of ongoing long-distance trade along what must have been regularly traveled, although incredibly extensive maritime routes. Some examples of this: obsidian that can be traced to quarries in the Bismarck Archipelago has been found as far west as Borneo and was also transported over immense distances eastwards to Vanuatu, New Caledonia, and Fiji, more than 2,000 miles from its source. Lapita exchange networks thus spanned an astonishing distance of more than 4,000 miles, a network almost of Silk Road's proportions. Exchange networks on this scale can only have been sustained by skilled community leaders who had learned to manage the complex socio-political relationships necessary to maintain kinship ties between far distant communities. Like many early agrarian communities where forms of consensual power first emerged, it was the skill of these leaders as much as any claim to superior lineage that was probably the key definer of status and authority in Lapita communities. The Lapita were also responsible for crucial technological innovations without which such voyages over such distances would not have been conceivable. One of the most important was the invention of the triangular sail, which allowed mariners to sail both with and into the prevailing southeasterly winds of the Pacific. A second key invention was the single or double outrigger canoe, a craft that provided much greater stability in the swells of the open ocean than a single-hull vessel could. Eventually, more and more of these maritime migrations took place until most of the islands that make up the Pacific region of Polynesia had been settled in what must be regarded as the last great chapter in the human colonization of the globe. After living in Tonga and Samoa for 1,500 years, descendants of Lapita peoples began migrating to the northwest and south across huge expanses of ocean to establish the more than 30 closely related Polynesian societies and languages we know today. Despite living on far-flung islands, Polynesians share common oral histories. They also share traditional stories and songs about their ancestral homeland of Hawaii, which refers to Samoa and Tonga and the surrounding islands. Most Polynesian communities also share common socio-political structures, including hereditary chiefdoms with communities structured around the chief's extended household and common religious and agricultural practices. The voyages of Polynesian colonization covered such phenomenally long distances that they were probably one-way trips done in stages. The actual timing of this last dispersal is hotly debated by archaeologists, however. The most recent thinking is that these voyages began with the colonization of the Society Islands, so named by Captain Cook in honor of the Royal Society, beginning around 1,000 years ago. The islands of the Marquesas, Hawaii, and distant Rapa Nui were settled next, all at more or less the same time, around 800 years ago. And finally, the two main islands of New Zealand were occupied around 700 years ago. Although New Zealand is much closer to many of the earlier occupied islands, the prevailing winds made it harder to find and reach, which explains why it was settled so late. Given the difficulty of reaching the islands of Polynesia and the near impossibility of return voyages or of the establishment of exchange networks between them, the colonists of Polynesia were effectively isolated from each other and free to develop their own distinctive, though related, cultures. Can we imagine the knowledge and skill of the great navigators who steered their tiny craft across thousands of miles of open ocean using the knowledge accumulated by generations of mariners who had come before them? Polynesian navigators memorized a phenomenal amount of geographical information, relying on mental maps to steer their fragile craft by the stars, by the winds, and by the ocean swells. Some outriggers from Rapa Nui, the most remote island of Polynesia, might even have sailed another 1,800 miles eastwards to the coast of South America. The evidence for this is tantalizing. Pre-Columbian sweet potato has been found in East Polynesia and Polynesian chickens in Chile. Like their Lapita forebears, Polynesian colonizers brought to their new island homes a range of plants and animals to help make them suitable for permanent occupation. Pigs, dogs, and chickens were certainly moved all over the Pacific by boat, as were crop species like sweet potatoes, bananas, and taro. It's not clear whether the Pacific rat, which Lapita brought with them from Southeast Asia, was introduced to Polynesia accidentally or intentionally, but it had major impacts on island ecosystems. It took such a liking to island birds' eggs that it has been responsible for the extinction of something like 2,000 species of birds, perhaps 20% of the world's total bird species. In fact, we have all sorts of examples of Polynesians inadvertently impacting the ecology of previously unoccupied islands. Within 300 years of their arrival in New Zealand, ancestral Maori had contributed to the extinction of all species of flightless moa, including the 12 feet high giant moa. Early New Zealand sites are filled with the bones of hunted moa, and the subsequent clearing of forest for farming, often through burning, finished off the moa for good. Something like 50% of all New Zealand's forests were transformed into grasslands and scrublands by Maori fire stick farming. Despite this ecological transformation, Polynesian colonization of the major island groups like New Zealand and Hawaii was undoubtedly successful, leading to increased populations and social complexity. But as in Tasmania, the communities of many islands that were initially colonized successfully followed a trajectory towards cultural simplification rather than complexity. New Zealand is a good example. The migrants who first occupied New Zealand's South Island were farmers who brought with them crops and farming techniques adapted to the tropical climates from which they had come. But in the temperate environment of southern New Zealand, where their tropical domesticate species simply could not survive, these migrants gave up farming and reverted to foraging, which is how they sustained themselves for the next half a millennium before the British showed up. It was a very different story on the North Island of New Zealand, where the environment allowed migrants to grow their tropical domesticates, leading to larger populations, social hierarchies, chiefdoms, even organised war. At the moment of European contact, the population of New Zealand was probably close to 100,000 people, most in the North Island, where the Maori were under the control of powerful chiefs who could mobilise the resources needed to restructure entire hillsides into terraced and fortified villages called pa. At least 6,000 pa have been identified. Chatham Island to the east of New Zealand tells a different story again. Here, colonisers gave up farming and reverted to hunting and gathering lifeways to exploit the rich resources of the environment, including seals, shellfish, and seabirds. The once substantial community on Chatham Island shrank dramatically in size and had no need for warfare, which made them easy prey to a huge invasion by North Island Maori in 1835. We can find comparable contrasts among other islands of Polynesia, where diverse environments coupled with extreme isolation led to differing outcomes. An especially interesting example is isolated Rapa Nui, also known as Easter Island. There, village communities based on successful farming grew large, wealthy, and organised enough to carve and erect the astonishing anthropomorphic stone statues for which the island is famous. Between 800 and 500 years ago, powerful chiefs emerged on Rapa Nui, controlling hundreds of coastal territorial districts. These districts consisted of villages with monumental stone plazas, and within those plazas, the huge stone carvings were erected. Some weighed as much as 80 tons. The residents even invented their own written script. Yet at the height of Rapa Nui civilization, the population was only about 7,000 people, demonstrating that a relatively small population can still attain an impressive level of development under the right Goldilocks conditions. Rapa Nui had enough cultivable land to sustain its peak population for a time, but eventually, partly because of deforestation caused by cutting down all the trees on the island to get the megaliths into place, the population and the entire culture collapsed, and the survivors were forced to revert to basic foraging for survival. Is there a lesson in this story for humans in the 21st century as we wrestle with our own potentially devastating resource crisis and climate change problems? In complete contrast, the large, lush islands of Hawaii, with their mountain streams and rich volcanic soils, supported large populations through intensive irrigation agriculture. Hawaiian farmers could grow around 24 tons of taro per acre and excelled at intensive breeding of pigs and of domesticated fish. Hawaiian population densities were as high as 300 people per square mile, and powerful chiefdoms or kingdoms emerged as large as those of Suma's early city-states. The largest Polynesian communities on Hawaii, Tonga, and Samoa shared much with states all over the world. Hierarchical and stratified social structures with supreme or paramount chiefs and priesthoods, with monumental stone structures and irrigation works. These societies all held large-scale ceremonies that included tribute offerings to reinforce the status of paramount chiefs who combined secular power with spiritual power that was believed to have been bestowed directly by the gods. Their empires, if we can use that term, were territorial and militaristic. Paramount chiefdoms emerged on 4 separate Hawaiian islands, taking in a total of 200,000 people who were ultimately integrated into a single empire under the divine kingship of Kamehameha I in the early 19th century. Enormous numbers of elaborate stone structures were built, agricultural terraces, irrigation channels, aquaculture ponds, and temple complexes, all evidence of the power of the Hawaiian chiefs. Small-scale chiefdoms may have contained just a few hundred people, but the complex paramount chiefdoms of Tonga, Samoa, and Hawaii included tens of thousands of people. The Tongan Maritime Empire incorporated 40,000 people ruled by Tongatapuan chiefs who extracted tribute from numerous island communities stretching across 500 square miles of sea. Tonga's chiefs also had monumental structures built, including tombs that used cut blocks of stone weighing up to 50 tons and a canoe wharf dating back to 500 years ago that required land reclamation and thousands of tons of fill. Once again, we see that all the preconditions for these states to evolve into full-scale agrarian civilizations were clearly in place at the moment of European contact. Regardless of the varying levels of development attained by societies across vast world zones of Australasia and Oceania, many of them shared common cultural beliefs and behaviors and participated in some of the most extensive exchange systems humans have ever constructed. Given the extreme challenges of maintaining such traditions and systems over such enormous distances, these tenacious human connections must be considered extraordinary achievements of human civilization in themselves. The earliest social networks, such as those in Australia, were developed in part in response to low population densities and highly dispersed communities. But later exchange networks were driven by high population densities and frequent contact between numerous contiguous communities. These networks and alliances can also be seen as strategic developments to help deal with survival risks caused by ongoing climate change and the stress on resources this caused. Where leadership in Aboriginal societies was based on status acquired by demonstrating skills in negotiation and the strategic use and control of secular and religious knowledge and resources, in remote Oceania, governance was specialized, institutionalized, and monopolized by hereditary chiefs. The management and control of all these networks required skilled leadership that used knowledge of secular, religious, and ritual practices to validate their claims to authority. In Australia and the Pacific, as we have seen, it also required exquisite knowledge of navigation and brilliant innovations in seafaring technology. These were the worlds encountered by the English explorer and master mariner, Lieutenant James Cook, as he sailed through the Pacific on his voyages of discovery in the late 18th century, voyages that would change the lives of the inhabitants of Oceania and Australasia forever. Even though many of their societies never evolved into large-scale agrarian civilizations or developed farming at all, I hope I have made the case that we simply cannot ignore their remarkable achievements. Comparing the histories of the 4 different world zones shows us that while population growth and intensification could definitely be dramatically slowed by different environmental, geographical, and social conditions that did not favor them, even those regions that never developed farming were still on evolutionary paths that would have eventually taken them to some form of agriculture if these trends had not been interrupted. These universal trends played out all around the planet, even though they proceeded at different speeds and produced a great diversity of cultural, artistic, and religious styles. Everywhere we find humans, we find innovation and technological and social change driven through responses to environmental challenges and generated by collective learning. In regions with the appropriate Goldilocks conditions, the transition to successful agriculture led on to towns, chiefdoms, states, and even empires. Can we say then that given enough time, all human communities would ultimately have established full-scale agrarian civilizations? It is difficult to provide a definitive answer. Yet in the end, the differences in the timing and geography of these processes mattered enormously, essentially affecting the global distribution of populations, power, and wealth. These differences help to explain the extremely lopsided distribution of the vast wealth now controlled by modern humans.